So, before we actually get to the case study, let's just briefly go over the highlights of what the Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program is. The National Park Service, or NPS, administers the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program with the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and in partnership with the state historic preservation offices. The tax incentives pro- The tax incentives promote the rehabilitation of income-producing historic structures of every period, size, style, and type. Through this program, underutilized or vacant schools, warehouses, factories, retail stores, apartments, hotels, houses, offices, and other buildings throughout the country have been returned to useful life in a manner that maintains their historic character. The Historic Preservation Certification Application is a three-part application used to apply for certifications required for the federal historic preservation tax incentives. The NPS certifies whether a building is a certified historic structure and whether a rehabilitation meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation and is consistent with the historic character of the building and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. 20% income tax credit for the certified rehabilitation of a certified historic structure at the federal level. And in Oklahoma, we follow the federal process. So once you qualify for the 20% federal credit, you automatically qualify for an additional 20% credit at the state level for a grand total of 40% dollar for dollar that is taken over the next 5 years after the project is complete. Only depreciable properties can qualify for the tax credits, meaning income-producing properties owned and operated by for-profit entities. Now, let's get into the case study. And we will start with some general statistics on the building and the project. We will be looking at the Benedictine Heights Hospital in Guthrie, Logan County. It was built between the years of 1926 and 1948. The start of the rehabilitation was in October of 2015, and the project was completed in April of 2019, with a date of certification of October 2019. The original use was a hospital. The hospital was ran by the Benedictine Sisters. The new use was of low to moderate income apartments, 52 units in total, 36 of which were in the historic building, and 16 were in new construction that was adjacent to the historic building, but on the historic property. So the estimated total project costs were $13.5 million, with the estimated qualified rehabilitation costs being $7.5 million. The estimated federal tax credits of 20% equals $1.5 million for a grand total of about $3 million back in tax credits for the property owner. This project utilized a historic preservation consultant as well as a separate architectural consultant. So here are just a couple of comparison photographs. The image on the left is how the building looked circa 1950, and the one on the right is when the project was complete in 2019. Here are some more comparison photos, but this time the image on the left is how the building looked in 2015 when the project started, and again, the one on the right is when the project was completed in 2019. So, now let's see how we got from a derelict building to a building that people want to live in utilizing the Historic Preservation Tax Credit, and this project started with a Part 1 and a National Register of Historic Places nomination. We use a Part 1 to request certification that a building contributes to the significance of a registered historic district or a National Register property with more than one building and is thus a certified structure for purposes of the 20% rehabilitation tax credit or for easement donation purposes. Or, and in the case of this particular project, use the Part 1 to request a preliminary determination of whether an individual building not yet listed in the National Register of Historic Places might meet the National Register criteria for evaluation, of whether a building in a potential historic district contributes to the significance of that district, of whether a building outside the period or area of significance of a registered district contributes to the significance of that district, and if the building is neither within a registered historic district nor individually listed in the National Register, the owner must submit a Part 1 and begin the separate process of requesting the State Historic Preservation Office to nominate the building or the district to the National Register. Please note that if the property is a single building individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places, it is already a certified historic structure, and a Part 1 is not needed. A Part 1 is required for all other properties, including individually listed properties that have more than one building. Since the property was not yet listed to the National Register of Historic Places, the Part 1 was used as a preliminary determination of eligibility. As such, a draft National Register nomination was prepared and submitted with the Part 1 application. Lucky for us, the information needed for the Part 1 is the same as the information in the National Register nomination. It's literally a copy and paste. Here are the components needed for a Part 1 application. First and foremost is the signature page, the first page of the form. It must be the form as submitted or as made available by the National Park Service. Accompanying that signature page is the write-up, which includes a description of the physical appearance of the property as it is today and any alterations that have occurred over time, and a statement of significance. A draft National Register nomination is also required to be submitted, as well as a number of maps, including a boundary comparison map, and if there are any available, any Sanborn fire insurance maps, Google Earth images, or any historic aerials if they're available. If you can find historic photographs of the building, great, but sometimes it can be difficult or they just don't exist. We will need photographs of the building or buildings if there is more than one building on the property, as there was for this project. The few photographs required to show the current condition of the building or buildings, both on the interior and exterior, and must be properly labeled. A typical photograph set for a Part 1 is about 10 to 20, depending on the complexity of the project. The Part 2 will require additional photographs to document the entirety of the property, so don't worry about providing everything all at once. These can, and typically are, the same photographs that are submitted with the National Register nomination, if applicable. On occasion, the applicant will not yet own the subject property. When this is the case, a letter of affidavit from the current property owner must be submitted acknowledging that they are aware of the undertaking and consent to it happening. This is the actual part one for the project. It included a fully filled out signature page, or page one, which contains the basic information about the property, including the name of the property, the current address, indication of whether or not the property is currently listed to the National Register, who the property contact is and their information, and who the applicant is and their information if it's different. The property name ought to be the historic name of the property or the address if it does not have a specified name. The write-up in the subsequent continuation sheets matches what is in the draft National Register nomination submitted with the application and includes a physical description of the property as it was at the beginning of the project before work began. It also describes any known alterations that have occurred over time and their approximate dates. It also includes a statement of significance or historic narrative of the property that explains why the property is historically significant. Remember that just because something is old doesn't necessarily mean that it's historically significant, and vice versa. Because the property was not yet listed to the National Register of Historic Places when the project began, a draft National Register nomination was prepared and submitted with the Part 1. Again, the draft nomination ought to match the Part 1 application and includes a physical description of the property and any known alterations and approximate dates. It also includes a statement of significance or historic narrative on the property that explains why the property is historically significant and in what context. The historic preservation consultant prepared the various documents and worked with the National Register of Historic Places program coordinator on the National Register listing and the tax credit program coordinator on the tax credit applications and process. Along with the application and nomination, a supplemental information document was put together that compiled the various maps, historic images, and any pertinent news articles for consideration and comparison. The satellite image on the left shows the property as it was at the beginning of the project. The image in the middle is a copy of the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map from 1948 that shows what the property looked like and was composed of at that time. The image on the right is a historic aerial image taken in 1937. As you can see in the 1937 image, the main building is more of a U shape with a west wing that had been demolished by 1948, as illustrated in the Sanborn map. Another difference between these two images is the addition of the laundry, boiler room, auto house building to the north of the main building. Comparing these various images and resources gives a better idea of the evolution of the development of the property and the area around the property as evident in the increased development of the surrounding neighborhood. Historic images and photographs are always a great find if you can find them. Fortunately for this project, the building was historically owned and operated by the Benedictine order, and the archive of the St. Joseph's Monastery in Tulsa, Oklahoma was the repository of all the records from the nuns in the hospital, and they never threw anything away. This meant that there were more historic images and documentation than is typical of buildings of this vintage and included news articles, reports, artist renderings, and historic photographs of both the exterior and interior of the buildings. A set of photographs documenting the current condition of the property before work began was submitted. The photographs were extensive and covered the buildings on the exterior and the interior and from the basement to the roofs. In total, there were 185 photos submitted to fully document both buildings. Please note that these photos were also used for the Part 1 documentation. For the initial Part 1, no more than 20 photos should suffice, and only 10 photographs were submitted for the National Register nomination. Accompanying these printed photographs were photo keys that depicted the site and floor plans and photo tags indicating the location of the photograph was taken and what direction the camera was pointing. Also on these photo keys are colors indicating the results of a space analysis describing the level of importance of the various spaces. Lobbies and main circulation spaces are considered primary spaces, shown here in blue, and as such, those spaces need to maintain a higher degree of historic integrity and less alterations. Versus spaces considered secondary, shown here in red, being individual patient rooms, restrooms, utility, and other support spaces, which can support a higher degree of alteration for the new use. The green spaces are indicated as being primary spaces, but are less important than the main spaces and are reserved for secondary circulation and reception areas. Basically, it all has to do with to what degree the general public had access to historically. One of the neat things about documenting this property was because there were historic photographs of the interior and exterior, they were able to get similar photos to show how much or little the building had changed in that particular area and what the historic materials and finishes were if they were still extant. An important aspect of every project is the official correspondence between the applicant or consultant and the SHPO and NPS. This project did require a letter of affidavit from the legal property owner, as the applicant at the time of the initial submittal did not own the property. The affidavit acknowledged the proposed undertaking by the applicant and consented to it. Detailed cover and transmittal letters are also important to keep track of what got submitted to whom and when. So once everything was submitted in a format that was complete and acceptable, the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, reviewed the submittal, issued their comments and recommendation to the National Park Service in pink for their review and official determination with the formal letter on the right. The SHPO's recommendation was submitted May 23, 2017, and the Park Service approved the Part 1 on June 23, 2017. So now that the Part 1 has been approved, let's look at the Part 2, which describes the proposed rehabilitation. The Part 2 describes rehabilitation work to be undertaken on the property and must be completed by all applicants seeking the federal income tax for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. The Part 2 will not be reviewed by the National Park Service or NPS until the Part 1 has been filed and acted upon. Even if you submit the Part 1 and 2 at the same time, which this project did, unless the property is already individually listed to the National Register, then you don't need a Part 1. Applicants are strongly encouraged to submit applications describing proposed work and to receive approval from NPS prior to the start of work. Owners who undertake rehabilitation projects without prior approval from NPS do so at their own risk. Proposed work will be evaluated using the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation and 36 CFR 67.7. Conformance with the standards will be determined on the basis of the application documentation and other available information by evaluating the property as it existed prior to the start of the rehabilitation work, regardless of when the building becomes or became a certified historic structure. The standards apply to both the interior and exterior, and the National Park Service reviews the entire rehabilitation project, including attached, adjacent, or related new construction on the property. The standards are applied in a reasonable manner, taking into consideration economic and technical feasibility. Certification is based on whether the overall project meets the standards. To be certified, a rehabilitation project must be determined to be consistent with the historic character of the building and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. The Secretary Standards for Rehabilitation take precedence over other regulations and codes in determining whether the rehabilitation project is consistent with the historic character of the property and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. For the Part 2 application components, again, is the form. The first page of the form must be the actual official cover sheet, and it must be filled out in its entirety, bear the applicant's original signature, and must be dated. The other sections on the subsequent pages provided may be expanded as needed or continued in another format like a Word document, just as long as the information required is given. If the statement was submitted If the owner statement was submitted with the previous part of the application, a duplicate copy is not required. Send architectural drawings or sketches showing the existing conditions and the proposed rehabilitation work in any new additions or new construction. Include floor plans and, where necessary, sections and elevations. Dimensions and notes must be clearly legible. For small projects, sketches may suffice, and drawings must be numbered and keyed to the application narrative. Send photographs showing the interior and the exterior before the rehabilitation, include the building site and environment, all sides of the buildings, all major interior spaces and features, and representative secondary spaces and features, including areas where no work is proposed. Photographs need to be labeled with specific information to include building or property name, view shown, description of view shown, date taken, and photo number. The amount of photographs required for the Part 2 will be greater than the amount acceptable for the Part 1. And again, if the applicant is not the fee simple owner, then the owner affidavit needs to be submitted. This is part of the Part 2 for the project. Like the Part 1, it included a fully filled out signature page, which contains the basic information about the property and project. Additional information includes projected project data, which, among other things, denotes the number of buildings, estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, and existing and proposed uses. On the continuation sheets, each item, feature, or material is described separately. First, the item or feature or material will be discussed is specified, as is the date of said item or feature or material. Then the existing condition of each item is described, followed by a description of how it will be addressed during the project, even if no work is proposed. Between the two descriptions, the photograph and drawing sheet numbers of where we can expect to see where the specified item is featured or addressed is given. This trend is continued until every aspect of the project has been discussed. For the architectural drawings, the bare minimum of drawings that are required are the existing and proposed site plan, existing and proposed floor plans, and existing and proposed elevations. Other drawings that are not required but highly recommended are existing and proposed building sections, existing and proposed reflected ceiling plans, and proposed mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plans. Here are a few of the existing conditions drawings above with the proposed rehabilitation plans below. Note that in this case, the existing conditions drawings were coupled with the photo key and space analysis. Again, a set of photographs documenting the current condition of the property before the work was submitted. Above is the photo image, and below is the label on the back of the photograph with the name of the property, the address, a brief description of what the photo is showing, who took the photo, the date the photo was taken, and the direction that the camera was pointing, which part of the photo was submitted with, and in this case, parts 1 and 2, and the photo number that corresponds to its respective tag in the photo keys. Please note that because the Part 1 and the Part 2 for this project was submitted at the same time, these photos were used for both the Part 1 documentation. Though if the Part 1 was submitted prior to the submission of the Part 2, only about 10 to 15 photos would have been necessary. Again, photo keys and space analysis that depict the site plan and floor plans with photo tags indicating the location the photograph was taken and what direction was pointing were submitted. As you see in these example photographs, the buildings were in fair to poor condition. So again, once everything was submitted in a format that was complete and acceptable, the State Historic Preservation Office reviewed the submittal and issued their comments, recommendation, and recommended conditions to the National Park Service in yellow. The SHPO's recommended conditions covered concerns with the treatment of the windows, the adjacent new construction, and anything else that had yet to be submitted for review. This last one is a blanket condition that virtually every project that gets conditions get. The SHPO's recommendation was submitted September 11th, 2017. And please remember that the SHPO's recommendation is just that, a recommendation. All official determinations are only given by the National Park Service. Once Park Service receives the submission from our office, the applicant will receive an invoice from the National Park Service to pay for the review. Please note that the Oklahoma SHPO does not charge for our reviews, but that is not the case for every state. The National Park Service issued a conditional approval of the Part 2, meaning that the majority of the work was deemed appropriate and consistent with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. The Park Service's decision was a conditional approval of the Part 2, but the conditions were not all the same between the SHPO's recommendation and the final conditions. The Park Service's conditions covered concerns with the windows, anything else that had yet to be submitted for review, but instead of having issue with the proposed new construction component, they had issues with the proposed new suspended ceiling tile system. This is an excellent example of why applicants need to wait for the Park Service's official decision before starting work. Amendments and phase advisory determinations use the same form. Amendments are used for a variety of reasons to amend previously submitted information. Advisory determinations are used to close out and get credit for a particular phase that has been completed as described in the initial Part 2 and/or subsequent amendments. Use an amendment or advisory determination form to submit information requested by the National Park Service for an application under review or on hold. To inform the National Park Service of a change in ownership, amend a previously submitted Part 1, 2, or 3 application, and to request an advisory determination as to whether a completed phase of a phased rehabilitation project meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. To amend a previously submitted application, briefly describe changes to the original application and describe in further detail in attachments if necessary. Use these to respond to a condition or inadvertent discovery or any other scenario where a scope of work change is needing to be requested. Make sure that if it is in response to a condition, that the information being submitted is what was asked for in the condition. Please note that there are no limit to the amount of amendments in order to achieve a compliant project. We would rather have a multitude of amendments that answers all the questions and concerns and have a successful project than have little to no amendments and end up with a project that does not meet the standards and gets denied. To request an advisory determination on a completed phase of a phase project, list work items completed in the phase and give the phase completion date. Continue in attachments if necessary. The phase completion date is the date that all work related to the phase was completed. If the phase completion date and the date the phase is placed into service pursuant to IRS regulations is different, the date the phase was completed is the date that must be reported on the form. The estimated rehabilitation costs of a phase must be reported on the form and are defined as the phase's estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures pursuant to Section 47 of the Internal Revenue Code. IRS rules require phasing plans to be set forth before a project begins. See the IRS regulations for information on meeting this requirement. The NPS can issue advisory determinations only on the phases of a project that have been defined at the start of the project in the approved Part 2 application and only for work completed in the defined phase. So this project did not utilize any advisory determinations. This is the Amendment 1 for the project, which addressed two things. One was a response to condition number 1 addressing the windows, and the second was to update the address for the applicant. As we can see on the signature page, a brief description of the items being discussed in the amendment was provided with a further and more detailed explanation provided on the subsequent continuation page. Condition 1 stated that the proposed replacement windows must match the appearance, size, design, proportions, and profiles of the existing windows and must have clear glazing. In order to ensure the proposed window meets the standards, detailed dimension drawings of both the existing and any proposed replacement windows showing them in relationship to the wall assembly must be submitted for review. The response states that the proposed replacement windows will match the appearance, size, design, proportions, and profiles as closely as possible to the existing historic wood-framed windows. The proposed windows were based on the elevations and detailed existing window information collected on site. The proposed window is a single hung aluminum clad wood 1/1 window with some units having fixed transom window. See attached additional information for brochures, detailed comparisons, specifications, and documentation of a pilot window installation. Let's look at those various attachments. As part of the justification for needing to replace the windows, a window survey was conducted. Here you can see the extent of the data collected for each window in both buildings, and an accompanying report that summarized the results and recommendations was also prepared and submitted. To accompany the survey, a document was prepared that looked at some of the windows, the ones highlighted in the survey spreadsheet, and described them in more detail to explain the grades that they got. Another document that was prepared and submitted was this one that documented and compared a full-sized pilot window installation to the existing windows in place in the building. A narrative for what was being shown and compared was supplied with each photo. To that end, a window manufacturer and unit was selected, and the brochure with selections made was also included with the submittal that matched the pilot window. And finally, per the original condition, a sheet of window details was drawn and submitted that compared the existing historic windows to the proposed windows side by side. Once again, the SHPO reviewed the application. However, it was forwarded to the National Park Service without recommendation, which, for clarification, isn't always necessarily a bad thing. There may have just been some extenuating circumstances for this case. The National Park Service reviewed the documentation and determined that everything was fine with the window except that the vertical dimension of the transom bar of the proposed window was not appropriate and needed to be revised. The consultant and applicant went back to the manufacturer to work out the transom bar issue and, in the end, created a transom bar that was acceptable to the Park Service. The other condition concerning the suspended acoustic ceiling was never addressed, and the resulting work did cause some concern during the Part 3 review. So, now that the work is complete, let's look at the Part 3, which is the moment of truth. Use the Part 3 form to request approval of an entire completed rehabilitation work. For a completed phase of a project, use the advisory determination form. Though this project was phased, it did not seek an advisory determination on either of the phases. The completed project may be inspected by an authorized representative of the Secretary of the Interior to determine if the work meets the standards for rehabilitation. The project completion date is the date that all work related to the project was complete. If the project completion date and the date the property is placed in service pursuant to IRS regulations are different, the date the project was completed is the date that must be reported on the form. Both the estimated rehabilitation costs and the total estimated costs, which includes the cost attributable to the rehabilitation plus all other project costs, must be reported on the form. The estimated rehabilitation costs are defined as the project's estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, pursuant to Section 47 of the Internal Revenue Code. If the rehabilitation project was phased or involved multiple buildings that were functionally related historically pursuant to 36 CFR Part 67, the costs reported on the form must be the total cost for the entire project. On page 2, list all additional owners and their addresses and Social Security or taxpayer ID numbers. Continue on additional sheets as necessary. Send photographs taken after completion of the rehabilitation work showing the same views as in the Part 2. This way, we can get a direct comparison between the pre-existing conditions and the after conditions to make sure that it is in compliance with what was approved and the standards. The set of photographs documenting the condition of the property after the work was complete was submitted along with the Part 3 application form. The photographs sought to duplicate the Part 2 photos as much as possible. Again, accompanying these printed photographs were photo keys that depicted the site and floor plans with photo tags indicating the location of the photograph was taken and what direction the camera was pointing. During the initial Part 3 review, a few concerns were raised by the State Historic Preservation Office, and the consultant worked to address what they could. One of the concerns was the acoustic drop ceiling that was never addressed in an amendment, and another was that the physical plant building was not white boxed. This is why it is so important to get everything approved before the work is started or completed. As such, when the SHPO issued the recommendation to the Park Service, a note was included about the ceiling issue. However, the recommendation was ultimately a recommendation for approval due to all the other work conforming to the standards and that some of the ceiling condition issues were a pre-construction condition in secondary spaces. When the Park Service reviewed the completed work, they did make an official comment about the ceilings, saying that though the treatment of the drop ceilings in the apartments does not meet the standards, the overall scope of the project minimally met the standards. So when it was all said and done, the Park Service certified the rehabilitation of the project on October 18th, 2019, and the applicant was able to claim the tax credit. Thank you, and I will now open it for questions and comments.